Ekranına yazdığınız soruları ben takip ediyor olacağım. David sunumun bir 40 dakika kadar sürecek sunumu blok halinde yapmak istedi. Sunumdan sonra soruları ben toparlayıp sizden gelen sırayla ya da hani önemine göre bir şekilde birleştirip David'e ileteceğim.
Ben de herkese merhaba demek istiyorum. Hoş geldiniz. Çok heyecanlıyız. Tarihi bir an bence bugün. David'in bizimle birlikte olması çok büyük bir onur. Dolayısıyla hepinize hoş geldiniz diyorum ve bugünün oluşmasını sağlayan Ayça'ya da çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ayça ve Greg'e merhaba diyorum ve çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ve sözü Emre'ye bırakıyorum. Ardından da David'e bırakacağım. Kayıt açtım. Kaydımızı da almaya başladık. Onu da söyleyeyim. Ekranı kapatmak isteyen olursa diye. Evet Emre'ciğim.
All right. Welcome everyone. Welcome David. It's an honor to be hosting you today, and we're very happy and we're excited. And we contacted you because you know that we've been having huge wildfires in Turkey during the past few weeks. And most of us actually witnessed a disaster of such magnitude for the first time in our lives. So we were kind of appalled and didn't know what to do during and after those fires. So these days, there are lots of questions and there are lots of opinions about what could have been done or what should have been done better before these wildfires and also during these wildfires. But also there are these questions about what needs to be done at those wildfire areas in order to restore or rehabilitate these ecosystems. So there are lots of different opinions, and obviously these opinions depend on what actually these ecosystems are comprised of and such and such. So we know that you're very experienced in wildfires, bushfires in Australia, because it's like a natural part of those ecosystems in Australia. And as Istanbul Permakültür Kolektif, we'd like to know more about your experiences about these wildfires and how these wildfires are connected to permaculture thinking and permaculture design in landscapes, but also in communities. So this is why we're here today, and I believe everyone's very excited to be hearing what you're going to say. Just before you start, I'd like to remind the participants again that we're going to have about 40 to 45 minutes of presentation from David, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers. And the rest, I think we actually told, but just to remind again, we're not going to have any verbal questions. And if you have any questions, you need to ask Nihan from Atölye Familia. So you can type in your question to the chat screen. Then I will be following those questions. And at the end of the presentation, I will be forwarding those questions to David. Okay, so David, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and I am sort of very pleased to be able to contribute what I can at short notice in a context where, of course, I come from quite a different place. The presentation that I am using was created for Australian audiences to promote a major essay, Bushfire Resilient Design for Land and Climate Care, that I wrote following the Black Summer bushfires that were some of the greatest fires that have ever happened in Australia. So I will show you the presentation and speak to it, but try to give some context for the complexity of bushfire as a natural disaster and design to be resilient against its forces, which is a very central part of permaculture. So I'll just share this screen. Firstly, I am speaking to you from Dja country at the headwaters of Australia's largest river, the Murray-Darling, and about 120 kilometres from Australia's second largest city, Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded by the Indigenous people who were displaced and dispersed by illegal graziers in the 1840s, and then from the 1850s by a surging population exploiting the richest gold region in the world. Wool from the sheep and gold from the ground contributed to Australia becoming by 1900 the richest country in the world per capita. This photo is a photo I took in 1983 following the Great Ash Wednesday fires, which were a powerful influence on my own thinking in developing bushfire resistant design. Australia, and especially the densely populated southeast of the continent, is one of the most severe bushfire regimes on the planet. And as a rich country, Australia possibly has the best firefighting capacity at a professional and a volunteer level. But despite plans to upgrade that capacity, without aware, active and resilient households, neighbourhoods and communities, climate change-driven escalating bushfire threats could overwhelm that expanded capacity. During and after these great fires, most people concerned about climate change, especially city folk, thought the Black Summer bushfires would galvanise a climate emergency response by all levels of government and the whole nation. On the other hand, many, if not most, living closer to the fire threat in rural areas thought the fires would galvanise a whole of nation effort to better manage the bush and our rural landscapes, often expressed in calls for more fuel reduction burning, light fires to reduce the risk in very large fires. After a great government inquiry, which mostly suggested more top-down control, the elements of truth in both of these gut level perspectives hasn't yet been crafted into a larger action plan, let alone been adopted by leaders who can galvanise the nation as it focuses, shifts from one crisis to the next. And of course, the pandemic has shifted that focus in Australia. So this may be a gloomy perspective, but on the other hand, I think other countries who are just more at the early stages of understanding these risks can learn a lot from Australia, both in that top-down professional management of fire and also the bottom-up community self-reliance. It's just that we have to get so much better at it because our fire regimes are so much more extreme. So while the Black Summer was quite benign in our regions, the fires affected so many we knew. And for me, it triggered a major new essay in which I tried to distill how the truth in both these perspectives might be integrated in local communities that are facing fire, even if the wider government and community remains conflicted with these entrenched positions. So this presentation focuses on some of the land management options that might be useful in reducing the threat of bushfire while simultaneously contributing to the wider climate emergency. Where are we? What's happening there? Okay. So this essay marks the 6th major period of my personal focus on bushfire resilient landscapes and communities. Since 1974, when Bill Mollison and I crafted the permaculture concept in a house on the footslopes of Mount Wellington that he had saved from very severe fires only 7 years before, that had killed 62 people, injured 900, and left 7,000 homeless. Now, since writing this essay in January, the pandemic has preoccupied my writing and activism. But these presentations I've been doing have been part of a continuing focus on this issue. So I want to draw attention to how the design principles of permaculture, we believe, are empowering in facing fire, climate change, and cultural confusion and other challenges in our time. Reading the landscape where we live is essential due diligence in a time of increasing extreme weather. For those who are committed to areas that might be prone to wildfires, relying on the command and control by the authorities are no substitute for household and neighbourhood level resilience. So while management of the broader landscape is often hotly debated, helping others in our communities make wise decisions about where and how to live is a priority for many who can see the changes that are coming and that are already choosing to get their own houses in order. So in the book Retro Suburbia, I summarised the landscapes in which natural disasters can occur, and of course in Australia it's most strongly in fire, relation to fire. The first point to recognise is that houses are the most valuable assets that can be threatened in fire, because nature will recover and regrow, in spite of people's sense that fire is a destroyer of nature. To a significant extent it is not. But the built assets that settled people have, especially houses, can actually be relatively easily defended from fire. Houses make the best refuges in firestorms, and evacuation is very problematic because it relies on just-in-time fossil fuel-powered transport on open roads in a context where fire changes very quickly, and it is very hard to predict where it will go and how it will isolate people. And the greatest risk is people exposed in the open. And even in vehicles, it's much greater risk than in houses. So houses should be the focus of any plan for bushfire resilience. The next level is to think of irrigated food gardens as the most valuable and easily defended landscapes that should reinforce the defence of a house and, of course, contribute to the economic resilience of the household, and really should be established around each home and in a more compact village context around that village, rather than those buildings being set in the dry, flammable landscapes that may be further away. So houses should be sited where productive food gardens are possible, rather than this idea that we might live in the forest. When we look at the broad-scale, unirrigated farm and forest landscapes in a Mediterranean climate like Turkey or Southern Australia, we have to accept that to some extent it is not possible to stop those landscapes burning, but we can minimize the intensity of fire and provide more protection by the way that landscape is managed. So vegetation and fuel management to minimize damage and assist fire control are the best that can be expected. But the threats from that wider landscape to houses and gardens are often overstated. Most houses burn down in bushfires after a fire has come through, and the fire leaves embers that catch into a building, and then it burns down. And in the absence of people to do anything, the houses burn. People return and believe the fire has swept through and all of the houses have been gone as a result. This is one of the myths that keeps recurring. But in Australia, we have a very good body of understanding the science about how this works. Many fire experts concur that after making our home spaces and households more resilient, the focus on the bushland-urban interface and the many small towns and settlements in the Australian context in bushfire-prone landscapes could radically reduce the loss of property and life, even if controlling destructive wildfires in the broader landscape remains problematic. So this start at the back door strategy is a perfect example of permaculture design using the zoning tool, where we concentrate our efforts close to home, where we have more to defend and where we have more control. And in the process, we might just learn in baby steps how to manage our wider and wilder landscapes beyond settlements that in the Australian context are much smaller populations of Indigenous people manage to do without the aid of fossil fuel technology or massive organisational complexity. So in most current urban fringe and small settlement landscapes, the productive and more fire-safe horticulture and agriculture zones that in a permaculture sense we would call the Zone 2-3 are missing. And historically, the managed forests and woodlands behind those areas have now mostly become thicket forests. So this lack of management in forests is something I observed around all of the affluent countries of the world. Because as people moved to the city and people moved to dependence on technology and other forms of energy than wood and not having grazing animals, huge areas have run wild. And this is especially true in the Mediterranean. I haven't been to Turkey, but seeing in Israel, in Greece, in Italy, in the south of France, in Corsica, on a 6-month teaching and study tour in 94, everywhere I saw these new wild thick forests because people are no longer managing the landscape. So if we think about the strategic focus on this urban bushland interface and small vulnerable settlements. In the Australian context, we certainly need to empower landholders and communities in active management of their neighbourhood for current and future benefits, so that bushfire safety becomes just a byproduct of people managing what in our English ancestors is called the common, what we might say public land. And we need to employ a wider range of labour and skill-intensive land management options to reduce, rearrange and accelerate decomposition of fuels, rehydrate landscapes to make them more capable of holding moisture and enhance biodiversity. And we need to enhance forest maturation to a more open, amenable and safe woodland structure where the trees are not so dense and close, and that woodland structure has a greater chance of being able to survive in a drying climate. I believe these principles are probably universal and would apply in the Turkish context. The last one, the use of surplus forest biomass to create a circular local economy of renewable, dispatchable energy and soil enhancing biochar, is a passion of mine that we are still yet to see realised in Australia. But I believe we can manage forests in this way. Of course, fire is an intrinsic part of the Australian landscape, especially because of its unreliable climate and infertile soils resulting from geological antiquity. And whereas somewhere like Turkey, which is geologically young and has more minerally rich soils, naturally has a vegetation system which is less fire prone, even if the climate has quite a lot of similarities. But Australian landscapes were once subject to the oldest continual land management through Indigenous cultural burning practices. And stopping these practices has left us with denser, more fire vulnerable forests. And then also the traditional settler land uses of grazing and forestry that once helped control bushfires have declined across large areas of the country and been replaced by residential, recreation and conservation uses in recent decades that have increased our vulnerability to bushfire. So over recent decades, we've experienced even greater destruction due to accelerating climate changes and changes in land use. Australia could and should be leading the world in transitioning to renewable energy base to reduce the root causes of that crisis. Of course, we haven't done very well in that regard. So the first strategy that is universally applied in Australia is fuel reduction burning. And this is the default land management tool in reducing fire danger and protecting adjacent settlements. This is effective in moderate fire conditions, but not in catastrophic bushfire conditions. So this has been well proven in Australia that these very, very large, most severe and intense fast-moving fires, the reduction of fuel by prior burning doesn't do a lot to help in those regards, but it does do a lot to help in more moderate fire conditions. In my observation, a lot of the fires in Mediterranean countries that are burning in places where people have not been used to fire are not really catastrophic, very severe fires. So it is possible that fuel reduction burning can help in in that regard. But with climate change and the frequency of intense drought and extreme weather increasing, these approaches become more problematic. And then close to settlements, the smoke problem and the risks to private property make this a greater problem. So some of the problems with fuel reduction burning is that it is typically too hot, like that photo of me looking with a very sour face in the previous forest. And this sort of intensity has a lot of problems: loss of soil, carbon and nutrients, damage to trees and habitat, new fuel from fallen leaves and the epicormic shoots that we can see. Should be able to see. There we are. The trees resprouting with these shoots after fire, very characteristic, of course, of eucalyptus, not so much of many Mediterranean trees. And of course, you get dense regrowth of eucalypts often following these fires, and this can occur in conifer forests as well, where the fire stimulates more dense regrowth. And the progressive dehydration of the landscape. So while most land managers think of fuel reduction mostly by burning as being the focus, let's see what. The rearrangement of fuels, whether that's with machines, sophisticated machines that mulch the fuel up, or whether it's use of chainsaw to reduce tree heads, or hand tools, rearranging fuel reduces the intensity of fire and encourages decomposition. So we can think of a book doesn't burn very well if we try and burn it in a fire. But if we tear up all the pages and crumple them, it burns very, very hot. So in the forest, we want to take the forest from the paper analogy to more the book analogy. Greater use of grazing animals to consume and trample fuels in farming systems, and especially in the Australian context, I suppose grazing animals have been our major control on fire. And historically in the Mediterranean landscapes, grazing animals moving in the common was the main way that fire hazard was controlled. Not just by eating the grass before it becomes dry grass in the summer, but yes, this breaking things down, walking on things, and opening up the structure of the vegetation. It's also possible to have soil amendments to help accelerate decomposition: biochar, fungal inoculants, added calcium and phosphate. But these are mostly at the smaller scale. And it's also important to protect and extend fire retardant vegetation along water courses. Now, in the Australian context, that often means it's actually trees that are not native to our environment, such as deciduous trees from the Northern Hemisphere that are inherently less flammable. So in the Australian context, we are having to learn that we need these systems. In some parts of Australia, this function is performed by rainforest vegetation. In the European context and the Turkish context, I think of it in relation to deciduous trees that might line the more moist environments, and whether that's nut trees or trees such as willows, poplars and other species, rather than the fire-enhancing species like the conifers and the eucalypts. So the next important management is the thinning of regrowth native forests. Of course, in our Australian context, that is eucalyptus. And maybe in parts of Turkey there are established eucalyptus plantations or forests, again, that are not managed, and people often, if my understanding is, if this is similar to what happens in other countries, people blame the eucalyptus trees for the fire. And of course they are very flammable, but we can see the same thing with Northern Hemisphere conifers. When they are very dense, close together, they create a structure which is very, very flammable and changes a fire from a ground fire, which is controllable, up into a canopy fire, which you saw that slide with a fire at 1,000 kilowatts. Well, uncontrolled crown fire can be 20,000 or more kilowatts per metre of fire front, and that cannot be sort of directly controlled. So to do this work, to create these fire-safe forests, we need to be able to get some return from that process to justify all of this work. And we need new livelihoods in this ecological forestry to create a foundation for jobs producing wood for dispatchable energy, biochar, forest fungi, and especially the potential for electric power production at a localized level to complement other renewable energies. So this is an example of the sort of technology which is developing rapidly in the biomass energy world. This one from All Power Labs in California, and it's just one of the many small manufacturers in this space. But I have added my scorecard on the left to their graphic, which shows in these systems you can burn wood, acorns or grain. Well, from a permaculture point of view, we should be feeding the acorns to animals, if not ourselves, and certainly not ever burning grain, while wood is the natural abundance that nature produces very, very easily, including from very poor, infertile and rocky soils. So in this way, I think there are ways in which we can manage those landscapes. I want to end just with the years of preparation we have done for fire. We've now lived and worked through what I would call a modest fire emergency, where this was the fire threatening our town. And there was a massive exercise of state and volunteer resources to defend our town. But we were also here prepared for that. And the areas which we had been managing did work to help contribute to defending the town. So I think it's important that we celebrate stories of resilient nature, the way nature comes back, and also to celebrate the stories of resilient people and communities, because there is no doubt that as fire expert Stephen Pine has said, we are entering the Pyrocene era, that this climate change world we can think of is a world of greater fire. Want to just reference some of the resources that are available from the Retro Suburbia book, which can be accessed online, and some of the other resources, this case study in bushfire design, this book by the Australia's foremost educator on bushfire safety, Joan Webster, and let's see, why is that not passing on? It's not, doesn't appear to be working. So there are, other resources, including the new essay, which can be downloaded from the website. So I'll finish there, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, David. We currently don't have any questions yet, but I'd like to, maybe not a question, but a comment. There's obviously lots of interesting things that you talked about today, but one thing that's really interesting to me is that you said people are no longer managing the landscape, no longer managing the forests. I don't know how it is in different countries, but it's sort of seen as the duty of the forestry department of the state to actually manage the forests. And the people who were living near the forests for generations don't actually manage the forests anymore. I mean, when there's a big fire, there are examples of people subsidized by the government to plant olive trees or fig trees, or like a monoculture of productive trees that would benefit those people economically. But if we actually manage these forests properly, then fire resilience will come as a byproduct, which is very interesting, and it's very typical of permaculture thinking, actually, for myself. And it will also help rehydrate these landscapes. It will also help decompose these fuel materials. And these actually help those people who are living near the forests they benefit so socially and economically from all these things. So this, I think, is very interesting and very important. And you also said that grazing has been very important in Mediterranean climates and cultures for thousands of years, but especially goats in Turkey. But they're also sort of scapegoats. So they're blamed for eating all these fresh shoots in forests and actually, preventing the forest from becoming mature. So they were banned or for many years in Turkey. And so that creates a problem for people who have animals, because they don't have any grazing areas anymore. But as you said, not only they don't only eat the fresh material that will become fuels, but they also actually, by stepping on these dry materials, they help with this decomposition process, and they help with reducing these fuel materials. So I think it's also very important, especially for Mediterranean climates and cultures, because it's been a part of the culture for thousands of years.
Yes, maybe I can comment there. It's quite appropriate that in many countries, governments through forestry services sort of banned goats and other grazing animals in forests, even though it was very hard for the people affected, because a lot of those forests may have had failure to have any regeneration, the trees only being very old, or alternatively, all of the trees that are palatable to the animals, for example, like say oaks, have disappeared, and only trees like conifers have survived, because goats unmanaged will tend to remove all the palatable trees and not so much the unpalatable ones. And a lot of people don't realize that the things that taste very good to animals are often the trees that are least flammable. And the ones that animals don't eat are the ones that are most burning. So there's a strong connection there. But so this thing is always a balance. And of course, after long periods without grazing animals, the use of grazing animals, at least in rotation, is important in these systems.
All right, so we have a few questions. The first one, does thinning make the forest vulnerable against droughts?
Generally, in Mediterranean climate landscapes where you have trees that are inherently resistant to drought and have deep roots, the problem, the limitation is extreme long droughts and the competition between the trees drying the deep subsoil and groundwater levels means too many trees can cause, if not the trees to die, then be very, very low in moisture and very vulnerable to burning. And of course, the worst fires always occur in the large droughts. Now, of course, if we thin the trees out so much and all of the landscape is eaten out and the sun is beating in on the ground and the wind is coming through, there's a point at which for particular ecosystems, the thinning of the forest is actually making it more vulnerable. So this is a balance, and that will be different in something like a chestnut forest to an oak forest or a eucalypt forest, that balance. But essentially thinning can improve the resilience of forests to drought.
I think it is very important to realize what kind of ecosystem, what kind of forest that you're dealing with, because as you said, a burnt down pine forest would be very different from a burnt down oak forest, for example, in terms of how you deal with it afterwards. So it's very important to know what you do, when you do, and how you do it.
Well, maybe I could just add there that the immediate response of even in Australia, of where we have these very resilient ecosystems that are used to fire, people from the city often, when seeing catastrophic fires, think that nature has been destroyed. But the most common regenerative process, of course, with conifers is that most of them tend to be easily killed by fire, but there's a prolific regeneration of seed following a fire. In forests where there may have not been any regeneration for many, many years or even centuries. So people are not used to seeing trees come up like wheat. And that is definitely possible. And of course, in that early recovery, it's very important what you do, and especially you don't want large numbers of grazing animals in a forest where new seedlings are all just coming up. Similarly, some of the Mediterranean oak species have some capacity from the base of the tree to reshoot in the same way that an olive tree burnt and the top being burnt completely can resprout from the base, or carob trees. So there's a lot of trees that are adapted to Mediterranean climates that have this partial adaptation. So rather than being totally killed, they may resprout and still have a root system which is capable of recreating the tree in a much shorter time than the tree would have taken to grow from seed.
Okay, so I think we have two questions which are somehow connected to each other. So someone likes to know how you deal with the burnt trees after the fire. In Turkey, they just clear all the logs and burnt trees immediately, like in a few months. And how you do it in Australia. And also the other question, which is sort of connected, that someone said they're living real close to a newly burnt down pine forest, and it feels so bad to wait for it to regenerate. So it's going to take years. What can I do, like personally, in a small scale? Maybe scattering legume seeds, burying composts, or what can we do personally? And also, I'd like to know what is the best way to manage a burnt down forest like a pine forest, because right now, as you said, people living in the cities, they see these fires from far and they want to do something, and the best that they can do is actually donate money to some NGOs so they can go and plant some seedlings. But this is highly debated right now in Turkey. Is it better to just leave the forests to regenerate by themselves, or should we go there and actually and actively start planting some seedlings? This is, I think, an important question.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult for me to advise without sort of being familiar with the landscapes. But firstly, I would say that with, although there is some reason to remove or bring down burnt trees, there is also some value in very large trees that are standing as habitat or for birds and other things, to leave some of those structures rather than this idea of clearing everything. So I think, but it is appropriate to salvage harvest a lot of dead wood out of forests. Of course, it's better done at a smaller scale with smaller equipment and whatever, rather than on a very large scale, and certainly not piling up all the debris and burning all that further, but to maintain some of that material in the landscape. In terms of the regeneration, especially in pine forests where there is dense seedling regeneration capable of happening, then a lot of the work, especially on steep country, that can assist that is making small swales across the landscape so water can soak in at those points and stimulate the germination and establishment of trees. When trees have become established, very quickly it can be a process that needs thinning. At quite a young age, as soon as the trees are a metre tall, if they are very, very thick, sometimes these areas need thinning, like with a brush cutter, cutting very, very small dense stems and leaving the strongest trees to grow. But it is also an opportunity, a bushfire, to take either what has been a dense pine forest and add in species that will make a more balanced soil ecology, like legume trees, and whether that is seed, prepared seed into the burnt landscape, or whether it's actually trees added in to create some sort of component of nitrogen fixing to balance the conifer. And then, of course, the third leg of what might be sustainable forests is to add in trees that are capable of growing in the partial shade of the regenerating pines and have deep taproots that go straight down. Of course, the oaks are the classic trees for this. Much more difficult to establish by transplanting, but often with sprouted seed or direct seed in the ground in more favourable pockets, it's possible to diversify the forest so that those slower growing oak trees would come up with the pine trees, and then the thinning of the pines away from those oaks would allow that to become more of a mixed forest. Now, the patterns of doing that and what are the right species, in some cases, the legumes traditionally in these forests may have been herbaceous legumes that in fact goats and sheep ate, and they may be completely extinct in some places. It may have been shrub legumes like we would use tagasasti, which comes from the Canary Islands, or it might be legume trees that could grow with the pines that could be species like Australian casuarinas or acacias. Now, of course, many of these same species might be considered by people as, oh no, they're likely to become weeds. And I think it's very important from a permaculture perspective to understand that environmental change means we need to assist nature to develop ecosystems which are in tune with the new and emerging conditions. So this idea of novel ecosystems, while at the same time we recognise the wisdom in nature that's already there to use the species there. So for example, I think in establishing local Turkish oaks into these conifer forests would be preferable. But if those species are very weak due to insect attack or there is no established way to grow them, then other oak species from similar climates, like in California, should be considered as possibilities for that function. And so I would take the same approach, when I'm looking at eucalypt forests. I would want to add a leguminous tree, and I would want to add a taprooted tree that will more likely to be a tree which produces food for animals and people and is less flammable, and thin out the eucalypts, and the same approach with the conifers. Sorry for the very complex answer, but trying to contextualize the information to give people with local knowledge the ability to translate or change what I've said to suit local conditions.
Well, there's no simple answer to any of this. The whole issue is very complex. But what you said last reminded me of maybe a paradox of ecological restoration. When something happens, when disaster happens, when everything goes back, how do you start? Are you aiming to regenerate or restore the ecosystem as it was before? Or are you planning to make it more resilient for the future? So this is, I think, a difficult issue for any area of ecological restoration.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, how we can benefit from keyline design in broad burnt areas without hampering natural regrowth? And how we can use stacking effectively to speed up the regeneration in vast lands?
Yeah, well, I suppose that second one of stacking effectively, the way I was talking about the forest in terms of leguminous shrubs and taprooted trees that might grow slowly under tall conifers, is an example of actually stacking different levels within things. Yes, I did have other slides about keyline and natural sequence farming as ways of modifying the landscape with earthworks to encourage more water to be held in the landscapes. And I think it is possible to apply some of those principles, at least on a small scale, with swales across hillsides, and also to provide some resistance to the effects of flooding rains following fires is one of the exacerbating disasters where the ash and nutrients of the landscape can be lost because it all washes away in the absence of the vegetation. I think it is possible to also, in forest areas, try and use roading access, well-designed roading access, to create these contour lines that give access into the landscapes, but also at the table drains of forest, of the roads, are actually catching water and holding water, and avoiding, of course, roads that run up steep slopes or across watercourses. In the watercourses, it's possible to use a lot of the debris to try and reorganize it into what's called leaky weirs, like North American beavers damming the creeks, not to solidly hold water, but slow the water down and get the water to soak into the landscape. So in Australia, the ideas of natural sequence farming developed by Peter Andrews are very much part of this principle. So the key line tends to start at the top of the landscape, catching the water in the soil and possibly in dams, whereas the natural sequence farming starts at the bottom of the landscape in the riparian corridors along the watercourses, and how to be able to catch and slow down floods and spread that water out.
Yes, I mean, as I understand, I think it's obviously it will be different for every topography and every different ecosystem that is burnt down, but it might be a good idea to minimally intervene and create these swales and water holding earthworks, like maybe small dams or key line or any other technique, to actually slow, spread and sink the rainwater that's flowing down the surface, which don't have this water holding capacity anymore because of the fires. And that would also prevent erosion, landslides, and all this ash and minerals from going down and reaching the sea or the other waterways. So this was actually one of the questions for you. The question that I'd like to hear the answer for is, as a teacher, how can I generate awareness of fire protection in our environment?
Yes, well, I think certainly natural disasters are that great opportunity for people being open and interested in feeling, whether it's through the threat or the shock or just interest in something different, that people are open to thinking about those things. And it is difficult, though, because often these historically have been, once in a lifetime catastrophic events, and people think, oh, well, it won't happen to me or us. I think the issues, certainly in the Australian context, have been much more about our own survival, because we have this very strong regeneration in the native forests, although they have been very severely damaged by repeated hot fires. There is no doubt there is enormous ecological damage, which is long-term, from this process of hot fires. The severity of fires impacting, as I showed in my presentation, that where we live and the threat to our life has been so intense that does at least motivate people a lot. And I think that establishing that secure base in the landscape where people live, as having the confidence that that can be defended means people stay in a region when there are fires. Whereas if people are not confident about that space, then they leave, and that means they don't see the fire, they're able to do anything in the landscape. They are just another logistical problem for the central authorities to manage evacuation. So I think there is a very strong issue that emerges if the fire regimes become more severe, and we start to see in places like Turkey the sort of fire regimes we have in California and Australia, and the authorities start trying to manage this in the way they often do, especially in California and Australia, is moving people in these vast ways. A lot of people support that because it's seen as the safest thing. But in the longer term, it depends on fossil fuel, open roads, communication systems, government budgets, and technology that we can't control at the small scale. The other thing that's happened is that when people are removed from their communities, there is a huge psychological disaster that happens where people are prevented from going back. And there becomes this divide between those who stayed and experienced the situation and worked together in some sort of post-natural disaster coming together that happens in all natural disasters, and those who were in some recovery centre prevented from even returning to understand whether their animals had died, whether their houses burnt, and that it might be weeks before they are allowed to return. And that creates this enormous stress and confusion, so that people need to think very clearly about that idea, oh, I'll just leave if there's a fire. You know, because yes, you may leave and you may not be able to return, and your whole world may disappear in that process. So this is some of the learnings that have come from what happens when communities are really severely impacted, and especially the work of my colleague Daryl Taylor in studying these large-scale, not just fires, but disasters where people are separated out and we have a command and control from above that actually, even though it may be well-intentioned, actually creates more problems. And certainly not unique to bushfire. It happened very severely in Hurricane Katrina in the United States. And it is a tragedy and a shock to people who have actually been through a natural disaster that they then experience the helping authorities as being another disaster.
It usually is. Yeah, it's, we had the same opinions about what the government should have done, not before or after, but during the disaster itself. People don't have trust to the authorities, either forestry department or other departments of the government. So it's, I think, very important to be able to form local, small-scale communities which know how to deal with disasters when they happen. And I think maybe, as you said, like the psychological factor is also important. And what makes everything connected is probably fear, and how to deal with the fear, not only during the disaster, but preparing beforehand. So people are ready when it happens. Of course, everyone's afraid, but they know what to do and how to do it. So they maybe stay and fight and maybe save their households. Question, I think maybe interesting. It is obvious that forestry ministry is responsible for dealing with fires, regeneration, and other issues related to the forests. how you guys, permaculturists, getting on with the forestry people there? Do you share the same methods with them? Do you think they also have similar understanding with us?
Yeah, I think in large context, permaculture has still had only influences at the margins with the issue of how we manage forests at a large scale in Australia. But there are quite a few people from a permaculture perspective who work professionally in this field, because it is quite a big field of work, and there's some similarity of understanding of perspectives, but also skepticism. The more significant change in Australia is the emergence or the re-emergence of rediscovery of Indigenous cultural knowledge, especially in Northern Australia, of how to manage what is called cultural burning, traditional Indigenous burning practices, and a rediscovery of those techniques, which of course were carried out by people only partially for fire safety, but to actually manage all the food and other resources in the landscape, and to actually maintain the spiritual functioning of the landscape as they saw it. So this was essential activities, and the main tool in that was very cool fires initiated in precise timing in particular ways. So that resurgence of that knowledge or rediscovery, it has been initially resisted by the fire professionals, but is increasingly there is interest in this. If I was to simplify Indigenous cultural burning, it's very, very frequent, very cool fires, we would say, very small flames, only burning litter rather than damaging the soil or damaging the trees. But of course, getting the timing of all of those things right is quite complex. So that's the big story happening in Australia at the moment, and it parallels what's happening in California and in some other places where there's also this history of older Indigenous knowledge in using fire to manage landscapes.
Which brings me to a question from someone who lives in the United States, and she was just asking that what do you think about the US fires?
Well, I think I've done presentations to the Facing Fire group in California that was formed following the Paradise Fire, and I certainly feel a lot more commonalities between Australia and California, because I sort of understand the economics, the land use systems a lot more than I do in the Mediterranean, and this distributed, dispersed settlement patterns of people living all over the landscape. Whereas I assume in Turkey, like in many other parts of the Mediterranean, there's still a lot of clustering of houses in rural villages and not so much distribution of people through the landscapes. And where they are distributed through the landscapes, those are often managed horticultural landscapes, even if they're just olive tree monocultures that are less fire flammable. There are some big differences in context between Australia and the United States, and some of that is due to vegetation, but also building techniques. A lot of the building techniques in the United States, the buildings are very, very vulnerable to fire. Tar roofs made of bituminous material, and so the whole design of buildings and their vulnerabilities very different in different places as well. But clearly, California is another one of the places and the west coast of the United States generally, where climate change is accelerating the problem. But there's also this long heritage of lack of management of the landscape, and that point of rediscovery of Indigenous management. And another similarity also is this rediscovery of shepherding, moving goats and sheep mostly for the purposes of vegetation management. Because in Australia and in California, a lot of our management of animals has been with fencing historically in large paddocks, large fields, and there hasn't been much heritage of shepherding like more in Mediterranean countries. And we are actually discovering that as a way of doing things, and some of it with modern techniques like electric mesh fencing and even GPS tagging of animals so they can be working in little spaces around urban areas. So maybe there is some advantages in places like Turkey where some of these things are not completely lost arts that can be rediscovered.
Sometimes even when you're stopping in a car in the traffic lights and you turn your head and you see a sheep grazing the middle section of the road where there's some grass. So you actually still see some of those things in Turkey. Okay, I mean, I think we're almost up. We don't want to take a lot more of your time.
Well, I think there is a lot that can be learnt, and I suppose I could finish with a comment about when I was in Israel in '94, and I was travelling through the landscape and saw unmanaged forests of Aleppo pine and other species, and I was talking to colleagues about the fire risk, and people said, there is no history of bushfires in Israel. And I said, you are going to have them soon. And of course, that context where that part of the world had been so denuded of forests and so eaten by animals that the creation of the Israeli state after 1948 was an extreme example of where the whole effort to reforest and get rid of all the goats by the Bedouin people and sort of establish all this vegetation, but then Israel being another affluent country, not using any of this wood for anything or not managing any of the land. And it was interesting that forest that so horrified me in terms of its fire vulnerability, the Jerusalem forest, burnt for the first time in history the next year. And there's just been large fires there. So understanding these changes in the landscape, changes in land use, but that there are some inherent advantages that places in the Mediterranean have of, as I said, the village tendency of village clustered housing and the more safe horticultural landscapes mean that it should be possible to sort of manage, even in a worsening climate, the forest fire problem.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. And it was an honor to meet you, virtually at least, and have your opinions about how to make our landscape and communities a bit more fire resilient. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hoping to see you or meet you again, maybe.
Yeah.
Dilek, anything else to add or say maybe?
Thank you very much for being with us, David, and your time, and hope to see you face to face one day.
Maybe. Okay. And,
very nice to meet you.
Very good.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Herkese çok teşekkürler. Görüşmek üzere. Hoşçakalın.